Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. This is a book club I've started on this channel in which we are not talking about books that are in the public domain. We are talking about books that you have to acquire in some way, either buying them secondhand for a pound or two, or getting them online, or getting them at your library. They are widely available. I'm going to try to pick books that are widely available, but not copyright free. Just I like the ambit of it, and I was worried at first that would put an undue burden on you, but most of you have said no, I'm perfectly willing to do this. From time to time, I'm perfectly willing to do this. So we picked a book that is very much well known. This is Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, the first book in what became a trilogy of novels about Thomas Cromwell, the counselor to King Henry VIII. And we are finishing up this book this week. There'll be we can do another video next week with further thoughts, but we're finishing up this book, and we'll talk about what we're doing next for April in the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. But it's in the final two parts of this book, that we really see something like the arc of the book. I believe that Hilary Mantel probably intended this to be 3 books from the start. Probably she did. I get the impression that she wanted us to see the rise, the greatness, and also the fall of Cromwell, which is very much not covered in this book. But whether you plan a first book as part of a trilogy or not, that book has to have some narrative unity on its own, right? Whether you plan on going to a second book or not, there has to be some unity involved. And it's in the final two parts of this book that we see what that unity is for this book. Each one of the books in the Wolf Hall trilogy details the downfall of someone. Usually parallel downfalls, but one that is bigger than the other. There are 2 downfalls in this book. One is, I guess you could say 3 if you count Queen Catherine of Aragon, but really one is Thomas Wolsey, and the other is Thomas More. As Katie Brooks pointed out, there are a lot of people named Thomas in these books. It's tough to deal with that. That's all. Wolsey's fall is orchestrated. It's the result of his failure to achieve a divorce for King Henry VIII, but it's orchestrated and reveled in by a group of people, courtiers and noblemen, who become the object of a years-long revenge plot from Thomas Cromwell. That doesn't have to concern us much with this book. It'll concern us a lot more if we move on to the other books in this trilogy. But the other downfall is Thomas More, who is a prominent figure, not only in the opening parts of the book and the plot of the novel, but also, as Hilary Mantel knows perfectly well, in the minds of her readers, because of Thomas Bolt's play and then the great movie, A Man for All Seasons. Everyone knows Thomas More. Everyone who knows anything about Tudor history knows Thomas More. They know also that they're supposed to venerate him. There is no better heroic treatment in fiction than the treatment of Thomas More in A Man for All Seasons. Unless maybe it's the one juror in 12 Angry Men, but mostly not. Mostly, it's A Man for All Seasons is a hero study, a saint's life, really. And gradually, that isn't enough in the course of this story. As any of you know Tudor history will know, Thomas More is willing to go along. He's willing to be a very effective arm of Henry's council. He's willing to work against heretics, what he views as heretics. He's very much willing to work in a police state. But there are things that he won't do. And the famous one is that he deals with the succession to the throne, the legitimacy of Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. He finds himself opposed to King Henry VIII. First in silence and resignation, and then in the Tower of London. Because you don't get to be opposed quietly to Henry VIII, especially if you're a high-profile figure like Thomas More. So, gradually, he and Cromwell become enemies. If they weren't always enemies, gradually they become enemies. We learn later on in the trilogy that they have a deeper history than we first thought. But in this book, the change is subtle and gradual. At the beginning, it's the disdainful, sure of his place, incredibly powerful Thomas More, who looks on Cromwell with disdain, with scorn, as a commoner, as a jumped-up lawyer, as a weird, silent figure at the back of the room. And then it moves to more equivocation. You have risen in the world, I have fallen in the world. And then to danger. There's actually a very vibrant scene where More first realizes that Cromwell presents a legitimate danger to his life, to his family, to his own survival, to the presence of his head on his shoulders. And then the complete reversal. Cromwell as the trusted advisor, More in the Tower of London, never fated to talk to Henry again, never fated to explain himself again, and all for ideological reasons. With Wolsey, it was at least nominally different. Wolsey failed in a task. You could say, I mean, the displeasure of princes, enough has been written about the displeasure of princes to say that that is justification enough. There were other reasons, jealousy, the workings of Anne Boleyn, but with More, it's an ideological dispute. He is in the Tower of London facing his own death because he refuses to say a thing. That's all. Not because he refuses to do a thing or has failed to do a thing, but because he refuses to say a thing and maybe believe a thing. And that brings the focus of these last two parts to religion. There's no way to avoid it. There was never any real way to avoid it. A large part of what Thomas More did in his official capacity as a Chancellor of England was religious. A large part of what Henry was doing for a large part of his reign was religious. We are tempted to think about the stripping of the altars and the changing of liturgies, but we're talking about millions of ordinary people living their lives where their religious faith is an incredibly important part of those lives. It's a major subject. And thankfully, Hilary Mantel never loses sight of that fact. She never actually does reduce it to baubles and sacred relics and the gold in monasteries and whatnot. She made sure to remember and to remind us that it's an incredibly personal, fraught subject. She's in a bit of a pickle because she clearly likes her character, her realization of Thomas Cromwell. And her realization of Thomas Cromwell very much does not like Thomas More. Thomas More is a bad guy in this book, as unthinkable as that is to people who read or watched A Man for All Seasons, or to a few hundred generations of Catholics who venerate him as a saint. He is a bad guy in this book. And there is a very conscious paralleling and polling being done, not between Cromwell and the historical record, but between the novel Wolf Hall and the play A Man for All Seasons. Hilary Mantel knows perfectly well what has fixed More in the popular imagination, and it's not his Saint's Day. It's this great work of art. And we'll get to that, because when I was reading this book for the first time, I was thinking, oh, come on. If you're going to make More the villain, if you're going to have Cromwell go on about, I hate how he's wasting all of our time. He's written this play with all the parts for all of us, and he's just sitting there in the audience tittering over his own lines, and it's such a waste of time and effort. All, in other words, totally insincere. When I was reading this book for the first time, I was thinking, well, okay, sooner or later, you're going to have to make this explicit. You can't just, if you're arguing with another great work of art, as only great works of art can do, they can argue with each other. If you're arguing with another great work of art, you're going to have to make it explicit at some point. But before we get there, we get the actual seriousness of the subject. Because you have to keep in mind, I mentioned the stripping of the altars and the changing of liturgy books and whatnot, but we're talking about people being burned alive, which is, it's unheard of. It will be beyond the comprehension of anyone listening to me what that is like. Some readers of historical fiction console themselves that at some point, sometimes, people who were condemned to be burned alive for whatever reason, whether it was treason or heresy or whatever, had a sack of gunpowder around their neck, so that when the flames reached that high, it would ignite the gunpowder and blow their head off and relieve them of the final agony. But most of the time that wasn't there. And even when it was there, it often didn't work. And even when it did work, the flames have to get there. it's I don't mean to stress it too much, although we shouldn't glide over it either. These are men and women. We saw an incredibly moving scene last time. These are men and women who died this way. These are actual people who died this way. This is a state saying, we're not going to cut your head off, which is, it's execution, but if it's done well, you won't even know it. Instead, we're picking the most horrible way imaginable to die, and we're making it a spectator sport. And you'll know ahead of time. You'll know long ahead of time. You will spend day after day after day in the Tower of London or at Smithfield just waiting for when you will be brought out to that end, and on a bright sunny afternoon where your body will be set on fire at the bottom, at your feet, and you will just live as long as you live. You will live as long as you live. There are many, many records of these things, of people being burned alive for hours at a time. And Hilary Mantel is wise to humanize that aspect in these final two parts of her book. Since they are about Thomas More's downfall, she can't really not do that. And she gives us an amazing example. Now, I don't mean to say that this is all grim, because she has a real great tendency for one-liners. And she gets off a whole bunch of them in here. One character, we're told, trickles into the room like a late apology. And we also get this great line about Princess Mary, who is a young woman at the time this book is being written, where Cromwell at one point quips that, I don't suppose she would be a bad wife for somebody who was prepared to keep her chained to the wall. That's rather good as a one-liner goes. But the main thing here is a scholar named John Frith, whose works I have read, and they are amazingly eloquent. They are. I don't know that Frith has ever been translated into English, but he should be if he hasn't been. Somebody ought to do it, and with a heavily annotated edition, that would be really good. It's doctrinal stuff, it's liturgical stuff. I wouldn't have a wide interest, but there are plenty of publishers out there who could do it, and who are aim straight at that readership. He's being kept in the Tower of London. He has been apprehended. He is a known associate of John Tyndall, who wants to translate the Bible into English and promulgate it all over the country, which is apparently a capital offense in Henry's England. He's a heretic. He is branded as a heretic, even though he was a former pupil of Stephen Gardner, who's one of the main characters in this book. Doesn't matter. He is branded a heretic, and he is caught, so he is in custody. And Cromwell is sympathetic. This Cromwell, Mantel's Cromwell, is sympathetic to him. Tries hard to get him out of captivity, even to the point of arranging for him to be transported from the Tower of London to Smithfield on a heavily wooded country road, openly hoping that sympathizers will simply waylay his two guards and take him prisoner, take him away, whisk him to the continent or whatever, get him out of Henry's clutches. Cromwell knows that perfectly well and is kind of hoping that will happen. But first he meets with him. And we get this. He is Cromwell. When he takes Frith's hands, he finds them all bones, cold and dry and with telltale traces of ink. He thinks he cannot be so delicate if he has lived so long. He was one of the scholars shut up in the cellar at Wolsey's College, where the Bible men were held because there were no other secure places. When the summer plague struck underground, Frith lay in the dark with the corpses till someone remembered to let him out. Cromwell talks with him about the case against him. It was asked him, what made you come back into England? No, don't tell me. If you were going about with Tyndall's work, I'd better not know it. They say you have taken a wife, is that correct? In Antwerp? The one thing the king cannot abide. No, many things he cannot abide, but he hates married priests. And he hates Luther. And you've translated Luther into English. Frith says, you put the case so well for my prosecution. And Cromwell says, you must help me to help you. If I could get you an audience with the king, you would have to be prepared. He is a most astute theologian. Do you think you could soften your answers to accommodate him? And eventually Frith tells him what all of these characters do. The woman that we read about last week, who was burned at the stake until she was nothing, until there's nothing recognizable left of her body, a little piece of bone here and there, and her friends come to scrape her up and collect her out of memory of her. Mantell reminding us that these were real people. These were individuals who died for their faith in a Christian country. And eventually, the conversation gets down to Frith just telling Cromwell what Cromwell appears not to understand. He says, "You think you can keep me at your house and wait for the king to change his mind? I should have to break out of there and walk to Paul's Cross and say before the Londoners what I have already said. Your witness cannot wait. Not on Henry. I might wait till I was old. They will burn you. And you think I cannot bear the pain. You are right. I cannot. But they will give me no choice. As Moore says, it hardly makes a man a hero to agree to stand and burn once he is chained to a stake. I have written books, and I cannot unwrite them. I cannot unbelieve what I believe. I cannot unlive my life." And we get a scene where that transfer is actually happening. The guards are peeing against a tree. They're looking the other way. They turn back, and he's just standing there meekly, going to his end, going to his fate. And we are told what that fate is. At Smithfield, Frith is being shoveled up. His youth, his grace, his learning, and his beauty. A compaction of mud, grease, charred bone. That is the ending to this character that we're getting. And that is meant to stand in for a lot of other characters. John Frith is an actual historical person. Hilary Mantel went on at great length when she was alive that pretty much everything in these books can be verified. There is a key way in which that is not true. But it doesn't become quite so apparent in this book. It really struck me in the third book. There's a key way in which that contention is not true. Because Cromwell was not a good guy. Okay? There is no doubt about that at all. But we aren't there yet. He is very much a good guy in this book. He tries to save John Frith instead of actively persecuting him. The man who would actually persecute him is Thomas More. But when Thomas More comes down in the world, when he is brought to trial, when he is brought to the Tower of London, he takes on a different tone. He tries to act as sanctimonious as he is in A Man for All Seasons. And when I was reading, I got all the way to the end of the book. I got all the way to the end when I finally got the moment that I wanted. Well, I finally got the moment where Hilary Mantel actually quotes from A Man for All Seasons and then rebuts it. Oh, because Moore is talking with Sir Richard Rich and Cranmer and Cromwell. He's talking with them, and he breaks into A Man for All Seasons, the actual quotation. "In the name of God, what ill can I effect from this place? I do nobody harm. I say none harm. I think none harm. If this be not enough to keep a man alive," and if you know the play or the movie, you're automatically supplying the end of that, which is, "Then in faith I long not to live." And you're thinking of Paul Scofield's magnificent performance, but he doesn't get to finish. He doesn't get to finish because he's cut off. Cromwell cuts him off. He cuts him in on him, incredulous. "You do nobody harm. What about Bainham? You remember Bainham? You forfeited his goods, committed his poor wife to prison, saw him racked with your own eyes. You locked him up in Bishop Stokely's cellar. You had him back at your own house 2 days chained upright to a post. You sent him again to Stokely. You saw him beaten and abused for a week, and still your spite was not exhausted. You sent him back to the Tower and had him racked again, so that finally his body was so broken that they had to carry him in a chair when they took him to Smithfield to be burned alive. And you say, Thomas More, that you do no harm?" I felt for Hilary Mantel. I almost cheered. It must have been hard to hold that in so long. This is not a short book. She held that in all the way to the end and finally just let him have it. She lets him have it a few times before this. Cromwell does not like More. Does not like his writing, does not like his supposed scholarship, does not like his behavior towards supposed heretics. And the book ends with the death of Thomas More. And with Thomas Cromwell famously turning his horse to Wolf Hall, turning his horse to the home of the Seymours. And that is at least one read-through of Wolf Hall. Tremendously fun for me to go through this for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club. Tremendously fun to hear from lots of you who've had this book on your shelf for a long time and haven't got to it. Because, a book like this, it comes out, it's a big historical novel, you feel well disposed towards it, then people start to praise it, all the critics praised it, then it starts to win awards, and then maybe the next book wins an award as well. And suddenly, the more you look, every time you pass that bookcase, you look up at it and think, all of a sudden, it becomes a schoolyard errand. It becomes more and more of a portentous thing, and less of something you're looking forward to enjoying. And I got the impression from the emails I've been getting that a lot of you are in that position and have had this thing sitting on your shelf forever and ever and have not got to it, and have pulled it down in order to get your STD infection for the month, and have been really enjoying it, finding it weird that keeps cropping up. This is not normal historical fiction. I agree with that completely. Weird reading, but also mesmerizing reading. That is wonderful to hear. That is absolutely wonderful to hear. That is Wolf Hall. That is our STD book club for this month. Now I have next month's pick already, but I don't want to just launch it in at the tail end of this video. So I'll make an announcement video for it this coming week. I'll probably do it tomorrow or the next day. And then what I'm thinking I'll do is that next week, for the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club, I might give some final thoughts on Wolf Hall, but I will also, next week, I will give a brief preparatory video for next month's pick. I'm against preparatory videos. I don't think a good book needs them. I don't think that Wolf Hall does, or it didn't need any more than the 2 sentences that I gave you. And I don't think it would really have needed those either. I think you'd have been fine. In time, you'd have been fine. I was just giving them mainly, to decrease the intimidation reluctance. And the same thing is true of the next pick. There'll be an element of intimidation reluctance. I'm willing to bet that the next pick is also a book that you've had on your shelves for a long time and been meaning to read. I'm hoping that that's true for a lot of you. We'll just knock another one of those off, because there's a reason you got these books, right? There's a reason you have them. It wasn't just to have them on your shelf. It was to read them. So that is we're going to wrap up Wolf Hall here. Maybe some final thoughts next week. Love to hear how you're doing, how you're coming along with this book, and we will revisit it next week. But I think next week's video on next Sunday or whenever will be much more concerned with laying the groundwork for April's pick. And then we'll just move on. I am convinced now from the emails and the messages that I've got that and the comments on these videos, I'm convinced that the Steve Tiberius Donoghue Book Club does have a place on BookTube. It has a little niche. It has people who like it. So we're gonna keep going. I have a couple of books planned. So anyway, that's this video. I'm gonna wrap this up for now. Thank you all for joining me for Wolf Hall at long last, and I will be back. Thank you, BookTube.